The night my late wife came to me in a dream, she looked exactly the way she had the morning she left this world, calm, steady, and more alive than anyone else in the room. We were standing in our old kitchen, the one with the chipped blue tiles, and the window that never quite closed. She held my face the way she used to when she wanted me to listen without interrupting. Her voice was soft but firm. "Don't wear that shirt they gave you," she said. "Promise me." I tried to ask her what she meant, but the dream dissolved the way dreams do, like smoke slipping through fingers. I woke up with my heart pounding and her words ringing in my ears. The room was dark. The house felt heavier without her, like it had learned how to grieve. I told myself it was just a dream. Grief plays tricks. Everyone says that. Still, when I reached for the glass of water on my nightstand, my hand was shaking. 2 weeks later, the shirt arrived. It came folded in a glossy gift box with a note from my brother-in-law and his wife. They'd been unusually attentive since my wife passed, too attentive, dropping by with smiles that didn't reach their eyes, offering help I didn't ask for, bringing food, and asking pointed questions about my finances, my house, my plans. The note said the shirt was a small gesture, and that I should wear it to the family gathering they were hosting that weekend. They wrote my name in looping handwriting, like we were closer than we were. The shirt was expensive, silk soft, pale, and immaculate. The kind of thing my wife used to tease me about. "Who are you trying to impress?" she'd say, laughing. Her voice came back to me then. "Don't wear that shirt they gave you." I stood there for a long time, the box open on the bed, my fingers hovering over the fabric. A sensible man would have laughed it off. I wasn't sensible anymore. I put the shirt back in the box and chose an old one instead, the faded cotton button-down my wife had bought me years ago because it made my eyes look tender. At the gathering, I noticed the looks, a flicker of annoyance when they saw what I was wearing. My sister-in-law asked, a little too casually, "Oh, didn't the shirt fit?" I said it did. "I just liked this one better." Her smile tightened just for a second. Dinner went on. Toasts were made. Stories were told. Then the conversation shifted, as if someone had flipped a switch. They began talking about how hard things must be for me alone, how overwhelming it is to manage a house, how smart it would be to simplify. They suggested gently at first that I sign some papers to let them help with my affairs. Temporary, of course. Just until I was back on my feet. I felt something cold slide through me. When I declined, the room cooled, the warmth drained away. My brother-in-law's voice hardened. "You don't want to make things difficult," he said. "For Alpha family." That night I couldn't sleep. I pulled the shirt from the box again, turning it over in my hands. Something about it bothered me beyond the dream. On a whim, I took it to a tailor I trusted, an old man with sharp eyes and a habit of noticing things others missed. He ran his fingers along the seams and frowned. Then he showed me what was hidden inside, a stitched-in strip, barely visible, with a pattern I didn't recognize. "It's not decorative," he said. "It's a tracking filament, industrial grade. Whoever gave you this wanted to know where you'd be." My knees nearly gave out. From that moment on, I stopped being the grieving, confused widower they thought I was. I hired a lawyer, a quiet one. I hired a private investigator who didn't ask unnecessary questions. Together, we unraveled a mess that had been tightening around me for months. They had forged documents. They had been slowly positioning themselves as my support system, telling people I was unstable, hinting that I couldn't manage my own affairs. The shirt was meant to track me to meetings, to banks, to anywhere they needed leverage. They planned to push me into signing away control, then bleed me dry while smiling for the neighbors. I let them think their plan was working. I answered their calls. I listened. I nodded. I even pretended to consider wearing the shirt next time. Meanwhile, my lawyer documented everything. My investigator gathered proof, messages, recordings, financial trails. We waited. 3 months later, the trap snapped shut. They were served papers, fraud, coercion, attempted exploitation. The evidence was overwhelming. Friends they had turned against me saw the truth laid out in black and white. Doors closed on them the way they had planned to close on me. The day it all went public, I visited my wife's grave. I told her everything out loud, the dream, the shirt, the choice I almost didn't make. The wind moved through the trees like a long breath being released. That evening, my phone rang. It was them. The voices that had once dripped with confidence were thin now, brittle. They begged, said they'd made mistakes, said they were family. said they didn't mean it to go so far. They asked me to help them, to speak on their behalf, to make it stop. I listened quietly. Then I said no. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult them. I simply told them the truth, that the man they thought was broken had been warned, that I had chosen to listen, and that consequences were not cruelty. They were earned. When I hung up, I sat alone in my living room, the old cotton shirt still on my back. For the first time since my wife's passing, the house felt lighter. Not empty, just honest. I don't know where dreams come from. I don't know how my wife knew what she knew. But I know this love doesn't end when a heart stops beating. Sometimes it stays, sometimes it protects. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to listen, it saves you just in time. The warning came wrapped in a dream, but it didn't feel like a dream at all. It felt solid, deliberate, as if time itself had paused just long enough for my late wife to step back into my life with a purpose. In the dream, everything was ordinary in a way that hurt. The familiar kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the way light pooled on the floor exactly where it always had in the mornings. She stood there like she belonged, like death had never touched her, and for a brief, aching moment I forgot that she was gone. I remember noticing how calm she looked, not sad, not worried, calm in the way she used to be when she already knew the answer to a problem and was waiting for me to catch up. She didn't waste time. She looked straight at me and said, "Don't wear that shirt they gave you." Her hand rested on my chest when she said it, right over my heart, and her eyes held mine with a seriousness that made my throat tighten. I tried to laugh it off even in the dream, tried to tell her she was worrying too much, but she shook her head. "Promise me," she said, her voice low and unyielding. That was when fear crept in, not panic, but something colder, sharper. The kind of fear that comes when someone you trust more than yourself is trying to protect you from something you can't yet see. When I woke up, the house was silent in that cruel, hollow way it had been since her funeral. The dream clung to me, refusing to fade. Her words replayed again and again, not distorted like most dreams but clear, precise, almost rehearsed. I sat on the edge of the bed with my hands in my hair, torn between grief and reason. Everyone says dreams are just the mind sorting through pain, that the dead don't speak, that it's all memory and longing. I wanted to believe that. I wanted the comfort of dismissing it as imagination. But the feeling wouldn't let go. It wasn't just emotional, it was instinctive, like my body understood something my logic hadn't caught up with yet. In the days that followed, the warning hovered over everything. I found myself replaying old conversations with her, remembering how she used to notice small things other people missed, the shift in someone's tone, the way a smile lingered a second too long, the silence where a question should have been answered. She had always been my compass, quietly steering us away from trouble before it ever announced itself. Losing her had left me feeling unanswered, exposed, and maybe that was why the dream felt so urgent. It was as if the part of me that had learned caution through loving her was refusing to stay silent. When the gift finally arrived, my stomach dropped. The box was elegant, almost excessive, and the note attached to it was polite to the point of being performative. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, my heart beating faster with each second. The shirt inside was beautiful, too beautiful. Smooth, pristine, untouched by the real world. Exactly the kind of thing that would make me look put together, respectable, compliant. As I lifted it from the box, my wife's voice echoed in my head, as clear as if she were standing beside me. "Don't wear that shirt they gave you." That was the moment I understood something fundamental. The warning wasn't just about clothing. It was about trust. It was about vulnerability. It was about the danger of accepting something that looks generous when you're at your weakest. In my grief, I had been moving through the world unguarded, assuming good intentions, because I didn't have the energy to question them. The dream pierced that fog. It reminded me that love doesn't always come softly. Sometimes it comes as a firm hand on your chest, telling you to stop before you step into harm. I folded the shirt carefully and placed it back in the box, my hands trembling. I didn't know why yet. I didn't know what threat I was avoiding or how real it was. All I knew was that the woman who had stood beside me for decades, who had protected our life in 1,000 quiet ways, had asked me for one simple promise. And in that moment, choosing to honor her warning felt like the first time I had truly breathed since she died. Choosing to honor the warning didn't feel heroic or clever in the moment. It felt irrational, almost embarrassing, like admitting I was letting grief guide my decisions. Yet something deeper than logic took over. I didn't announce my choice to anyone. I didn't argue or explain. I simply decided that no matter how small the request seemed, I would follow it. That quiet decision became a line I refused to cross, even as pressure began to build around me in subtle, almost courteous ways. In the days after the gift arrived, messages started coming in, gentle reminders dressed as concern. Was I coming to the gathering? Did the shirt fit? They mentioned how good it would look on me, how proud my late wife would have been to see me dressed so well. That detail made my skin crawl. It felt rehearsed, as if they were testing how easily they could guide my emotions. Each message tightened something in my chest, but I stayed polite, vague, agreeable on the surface. I thanked them. I said I was doing my best. And all the while, I kept the shirt folded neatly out of sight, like a secret I wasn't ready to reveal. When the day of the gathering came, I stood in front of my closet for a long time. The silk shirt waited in its box, immaculate and accusing, while my old cotton shirt hung there quietly, worn soft by years of ordinary life. My hand hovered between them, doubt whispering that I was being foolish, that I was risking awkwardness, judgment, even ridicule. Then I remembered my wife's eyes in the dream, steady, unafraid, and I reached for the old shirt. The moment I buttoned it, a strange calm settled over me, as if I had aligned myself with something solid and true. The reaction was immediate, though understated. When I arrived, conversations paused for half a beat too long. Eyes flicked down to my chest and back up to my face. Smiles adjusted themselves. Someone joked lightly about comfort over style, and everyone laughed just a little too quickly. I laughed too, playing my part, but inside I was alert in a way I hadn't been for months. Not paranoid aware. The warning had sharpened my senses, and now I was noticing things I would have ignored before. As the evening unfolded, the kindness began to feel conditional. Compliments were paired with suggestions. Concern came with solutions already decided. They spoke about my future as if it were a fragile object better handled by someone else. I nodded, listened, and offered noncommittal responses, all while feeling a growing certainty that my choice not to wear the shirt had shifted something important. It was as if I had disrupted a script they expected me to follow, and now they were improvising, unsure of how much control they still had. Later, alone in my house, I examined the shirt again, not with fear, but with curiosity. I looked at it not as a gift, but as a symbol of how easily grief can be exploited. I thought about how close I had come to accepting everything they offered without question, mistaking attention for care. If I had worn it, I realized, I might have stepped fully into the role they had prepared for me, the grateful, dependent widower, eager for guidance, too exhausted to resist. Not wearing it was my first act of resistance, even if I hadn't understood that at the time. That single choice changed the rhythm of everything that followed. It taught me that trust doesn't have to be all or nothing, that it's allowed to pause, to observe, to withhold. It reminded me that listening to instinct is not weakness, especially when that instinct has been shaped by years of loving someone who valued caution and clarity. My wife had always believed that danger rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives wrapped in politeness, opportunity, and smiles. By honoring her warning, I wasn't clinging to the past, I was using it. What surprised me most was how empowering the decision became. Each time doubt crept in, I remembered that I had already chosen wisely once. That memory gave me strength. It grounded me. It made me less eager to please and more willing to wait. I stopped rushing to respond to messages. I asked questions instead of agreeing automatically. I paid attention to what was said and what was avoided. Slowly, the fog of grief lifted just enough for clarity to take its place. Looking back, I understand that not wearing the shirt was never about superstition or blind faith. It was about reclaiming agency at a moment when I was most vulnerable. It was about recognizing that love, even after loss, can still guide us towards self-preservation. By choosing to listen, by trusting the quiet warning instead of dismissing it, I took the first step out of the trap being set for me, long before I even knew it existed. As time passed, the mask they wore began to slip, not all at once, but in fragments small enough that they might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't already learned to pay attention. What had once looked like concern started to reveal sharp edges. Their questions became more frequent, more specific, circling around my finances, my legal documents, the status of the house my wife and I had built together. At first, the inquiries were framed as casual conversation, the kind you excuse because you assume good intentions. But repetition has a way of exposing motive, and soon I realized that the same topics resurfaced again and again, as if they were taking inventory of my life. They spoke often about how fragile I seemed lately. They used that word deliberately, I think, testing it in the air to see if it would stick. When I disagreed with a suggestion or expressed uncertainty, they exchanged glances that lingered a second too long, then gently reminded me of how much I had been through, how grief can cloud judgment. The implication was always the same: I couldn't be trusted to make decisions on my own. It was subtle enough to pass as kindness, but persistent enough to feel like erosion, slowly wearing down the foundation of my independence. I started noticing how their generosity came with invisible strings. Offers of help arrived prepackaged with expectations. If they handled a phone call for me, they wanted access to my contacts. If they brought paperwork, they insisted on sitting beside me while I read it, pointing to lines they said were just standard. They praised my cooperation when I went along with them and grew cool when I hesitated. It dawned on me that this wasn't support, it was conditioning. They were training me to accept guidance without question, to equate compliance with peace. What hurt the most was how they used my wife's memory as leverage. They spoke of her often, telling stories that painted her as practical, obedient, grateful for their presence. They claimed she would have wanted me to rely on them now, to let them step in where she could not. Each time they invoked her name, it felt like a trespass, a rewriting of someone I knew better than anyone. The more they did it, the clearer it became that this wasn't about honoring her. It was about disarming me emotionally, turning my grief into a tool. Behind closed doors, the tone shifted further. When I resisted more firmly, patience thinned. Their voices hardened, smiles disappearing as soon as they thought I wasn't looking. They began warning me about consequences, though they never used the word outright. They spoke of how difficult things could become for someone alone, how quickly misunderstandings spread, how easily people could be convinced that a grieving man wasn't stable. The message was unmistakable: cooperate or risk being isolated and discredited. That was when I fully understood the depth of the manipulation. They weren't just trying to help themselves to my assets, they were laying the groundwork to control the narrative of who I was. If I complied, I would be the grateful relative who needed assistance. If I didn't, I would become the troubled widower who refused help. Either way, they intended to define me. Recognizing that truth was both terrifying and clarifying. Fear lost its edge once it was named. Instead of confronting them, I observed, I listened. I let them talk, recording patterns in my mind the way one studies a language before speaking it. I noticed how their stories contradicted each other, how timelines shifted depending on who was listening. I saw how quickly they reassured outsiders of my progress, while privately emphasizing my supposed weakness. Each inconsistency strengthened my resolve. This was no misunderstanding. This was strategy. The realization changed how I moved through my days. I became careful with my words, deliberate with my actions. I stopped sharing details about my plans and kept conversations focused on the present. I sought advice quietly, choosing professionals bound by ethics rather than relatives bound by self-interest. With every step, the illusion of their benevolence crumbled further, revealing a core of entitlement and greed that had likely existed long before my wife's death. What stayed with me most was the sense of betrayal, not because they had shown their true nature, but because they had chosen my lowest moment to do it. They saw grief not as something to respect, but as an opening. That knowledge hardened something inside me, but it also restored something I thought I'd lost: clarity. I was no longer confused about who stood on which side of the line. By the time I accepted fully that their kindness was a disguise, I was no longer the man they believed they could control. The fog had lifted enough for me to see the trap in its entirety, and once seen, it lost its power. Their manipulation depended on silence, shame, and my willingness to doubt myself. Understanding that was the turning point, the moment I stopped reacting and started preparing, not out of anger, but out of a calm determination to protect what was mine and to honor the truth my wife's warning had set in motion. Once the truth settled in, I understood that reacting emotionally would only give them what they wanted. Anger would make me predictable. Fear would make me sloppy. Confrontation would warn them that I was no longer the easy target they believed me to be. So I chose something far more dangerous to them than outrage. I chose patience. I let them think their efforts were working, that their pressure was slowly bending me into cooperation. I nodded more than I spoke. I allowed pauses to stretch. I became quieter, smaller, exactly as they expected a grieving man to be. Behind that silence, however, everything changed. I began documenting every interaction, not obsessively, but carefully. Dates, times, phrasing, who said what, and in front of whom. I noticed how often instructions were disguised as suggestions, and how frequently urgency was used to rush decisions. Just sign this now. We can explain later. There's no need to involve outsiders. Those phrases repeated like a script, and repetition has a way of turning whispers into evidence. I didn't challenge them. I let them speak freely, confident that their own words would eventually betray them. At the same time, I rebuilt my support system from the ground up, quietly and deliberately. I consulted professionals who had no emotional stake in my life, people trained to see patterns of coercion without sentiment clouding their judgment. I asked questions without revealing my conclusions. I listened more than I talked. Each conversation confirmed what I already sensed, that what I was experiencing wasn't confusion or miscommunication, but a calculated attempt to gain control. The hardest part was resisting the urge to explain myself. Grief makes you want to justify every boundary, to apologize for protecting yourself. I had to unlearn that instinct. I practiced saying less. I practiced letting discomfort exist without smoothing it over. When they pressed for answers, I delayed. When they demanded clarity, I offered ambiguity. It frustrated them, and I could feel it, but frustration was safer than suspicion. As long as they believed I was still undecided, they continued to expose themselves. I learned to treat each interaction like a mirror rather than a battlefield. Instead of pushing back, I reflected their words back to them, asking for clarification, pretending not to understand. The more I did this, the more tangled their explanations became. Stories shifted. Justifications contradicted earlier claims. What they expected to be private assumptions slipped out as casual remarks. They began revealing not just what they wanted, but how entitled they felt to it. There were moments when doubt crept in late at night, when the house was quiet and the weight of doing this alone pressed down on me. I wondered if I was overthinking, if patience was just another form of avoidance. But then I remembered the alternative, reacting too soon, giving them time to destroy evidence, to reshape the narrative, to paint me as unstable. Restraint wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Slowly, the balance of power shifted. Without realizing it, they began adjusting their behavior around me, testing new angles, growing more aggressive in private and more performative in public. That contrast became invaluable. The difference between who they were when watched and who they were when they thought they weren't spoke louder than any accusation I could have made. I let the contrast exist. I let it grow. What surprised me most was how this approach healed something inside me. For months after my wife's death, I had felt like life was happening to me, like I was being carried along by decisions made elsewhere. Choosing patience gave me agency again. Each measured step reminded me that I still had control, that I could protect myself without becoming hardened or cruel. I wasn't seeking revenge in the explosive sense. They would have expected that. What I was building was inevitability. By the time everything was in place, there was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting or slammed doors. There was only clarity. Evidence speaks calmly. Truth doesn't need volume. When the moment came, it arrived not as chaos but as resolution, the natural conclusion of choices they had made while believing no one was watching. Looking back, I understand that patience was the sharpest tool I could have chosen. It allowed their own actions to define them. It preserved my dignity while dismantling their control. And most importantly, it honored the warning that had started everything, not by rushing to fight, but by standing still long enough to see the whole picture before moving. When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't explode, it unfolded. Piece by piece, quietly, relentlessly, the story they had tried so hard to control slipped out of their hands and into the open. I didn't announce anything. I didn't accuse or threaten. I simply let the evidence speak in rooms where emotions had no authority. What followed wasn't dramatic in the way movies portray justice, but it was far more devastating to them, because it couldn't be argued away. The first cracks appeared in their confidence. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages that once came quickly now arrived late and defensive. People who had previously spoken to me with thinly veiled pity began asking careful questions instead. Word spreads differently when it's carried by documents instead of rumors. Every signed paper, every recorded instruction, every inconsistency lined up to tell a story that no one could dismiss as coincidence. The image they had crafted of themselves as helpful, selfless relatives dissolved under scrutiny. What struck me most was how fast their tone changed once they realized they were no longer in control. The gentle authority vanished. In its place came panic disguised as outrage. They claimed betrayal. They accused me of misunderstanding, of exaggeration, of being influenced by outsiders. The irony was sharp. They were suddenly saying the very things they had once implied about me. But this time, the audience was different, and sympathy no longer leaned in their favor. As the process moved forward, people who had distanced themselves from me began reaching out. Quiet apologies arrived first, then hesitant conversations. They told me about comments that had been made behind my back, about concerns planted subtly over months. Seeing it all laid out, they finally understood how carefully the narrative had been engineered. Watching that realization spread was sobering. It reminded me how easily perception can be shaped and how difficult it is to undo once set in motion. For those who had tried to exploit my grief, the consequences were not theatrical but complete. Opportunities closed, trust evaporated. Relationships that had once served them fell away when truth replaced convenience. They lost not just what they had hoped to gain from me, but the standing they had taken for granted. That loss weighed heavier than any punishment I could have delivered myself. And then, after the silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, they came back. Not with confidence, not with strategy, with desperation. The voices on the phone barely resembled the ones I remembered. Gone was the certainty, the entitlement, the assumption that I would eventually give in. They spoke quickly, stumbling over words as if speed might compensate for sincerity. They said they were sorry. They said they had been under stress. They said things had gone too far. They asked, no, begged, for me to intervene, to soften the outcome, to remember that we were family. Listening to them was surreal. Months earlier, they had spoken to me as if I were incapable of making decisions. Now they were pleading for mercy, hoping I would rescue them from the consequences of their own actions. For a moment, I felt the old instinct rise, the desire to smooth things over, to ease tension, to end discomfort. Grief had trained me to avoid conflict. But clarity had retrained me to value truth. I didn't respond with anger. I didn't remind them of every calculated move, every quiet threat, every manipulation wrapped in concern. I simply told them that I couldn't undo what had been done, just as they couldn't undo the choices that led here. I told them that asking for forgiveness does not grant immunity from accountability. My voice was steady, calm, final. When the call ended, I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. Their downfall wasn't my victory, it was the restoration of balance. The world had corrected something that had tilted dangerously out of alignment. I hadn't taken revenge by destroying them. I had allowed truth to remove the protection their deception provided. What remained was justice in its most understated form, reality asserting itself. That night, I sat alone and thought about how close I had come to losing everything, not just materially, but emotionally. How easily grief could have been turned into surrender. The fact that they begged in the end wasn't proof of my power. It was proof of how wrong they had been about me from the beginning. They mistook silence for weakness. They mistook patience for ignorance. And in doing so, they built their own collapse. By the time they reached out in desperation, there was nothing left for me to give, not because I was cruel, but because I was finally whole enough to know that saving someone who tried to destroy you is not forgiveness. It's erasure of self. And that was one thing I would never allow again. When everything was finally over, there was no applause, no sense of dramatic closure the way stories often promise. Instead, there was a quiet stillness that settled into my life, unfamiliar at first, then slowly comforting. The people who had tried to break me faded into the background, reduced to distant consequences and closed chapters. What remained was me, standing in the life my wife and I had built, realizing for the first time since her death that I was no longer merely surviving. I was choosing how to live. Their last attempt to reach me came not with demands or schemes, but with pleading. They showed up smaller than I had ever seen them, stripped of certainty, their confidence replaced by fear. They spoke about family, about second chances, about how regret should count for something. It was strange hearing those words from people who had shown no hesitation when they believed I was weak. I listened without interruption, not because I owed them that courtesy, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain of my response. Saying no did not feel cruel. It felt honest. I told them that forgiveness is a personal choice, but consequences are not. I explained that what they had done wasn't a mistake made in confusion or desperation. It was a series of calculated decisions, each one easier than the last because they believed I would never push back. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I didn't justify my boundaries. I simply stated them. For the first time, I watched realization settle in their eyes. They no longer had access to me, my sympathy, or my silence. After they left, I expected to feel anger or bitterness, but neither came. Instead, I felt a profound sense of alignment, as if something inside me had finally clicked into place. For months, grief had hollowed me out, leaving me unsure of who I was without my wife. In protecting myself, I had unknowingly begun rebuilding that identity. I wasn't just the man she loved. I was the man she trusted to stand on his own. In the days that followed, small changes began to matter again. Mornings felt less heavy. I noticed light through windows instead of shadows on walls. I found myself speaking her name without pain tightening my chest, remembering her not as a loss, but as a presence that had shaped me. Her warning had not kept me trapped in the past. It had carried me forward, guiding me through danger when I was most vulnerable. What stayed with me most was the understanding that strength doesn't always look like resistance. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like waiting. Sometimes it looks like refusing to explain yourself to people who have already proven they don't listen in good faith. I learned that boundaries don't require permission, and dignity doesn't need witnesses. I also learned something quieter, but deeper: revenge does not have to be loud to be complete. There was no satisfaction in watching them fall apart, no pleasure in their desperation. The real victory was living well without them, unburdened by their manipulation, unafraid of standing alone. Their punishment was not my refusal. It was the truth they could no longer escape. One evening, as I sat in the same kitchen where my wife had appeared in my dream, I felt a sense of gratitude that surprised me. Not for what had happened, but for what it had revealed. I finally understood that love can outlast death in ways that aren't sentimental or symbolic. It can be practical, protective, fierce. My wife had warned me not to wear a shirt, but what she was really telling me was not to step into a role that would erase me. I don't know if she truly visited me, or if some part of her lives on in the instincts she helped shape over a lifetime. Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that I listened. That choice changed everything. It kept me from being consumed by grief, from being exploited by those who mistook kindness for weakness. It reminded me that even in loss, I am allowed to protect myself. Now, when I think about them, there is no anger left, only distance. And when I think about her, there is no longer only sorrow. There is trust. The kind that survives endings. The kind that teaches you how to stand when you think you can't. And in that quiet understanding, I found something stronger than revenge: peace earned, dignity intact, and a life reclaimed on my own terms.